Welcome back. Moving on from Star Trek The Next Generation, I thought my next Trek rewatch would be Star Trek Enterprise, which I think I watched for the first time probably in the 2010s or maybe a little before then. I did not see it first run. I didn't. Most of my life in my where I've lived, I've never had really cable TV or any kind of TV, so I never watched anything like that first run. And I think my first impression of Enterprise from the trailers and Scott Bakula, I thought, ugh, I'm done. As much as I adored Voyager, it just seemed like, and I think initially I wasn't very interested in the, pre the original series timeline, but I finally got around to it and I enjoyed it. I have to say, I was kind of surprised at how much I did enjoy it. It's the least of the main Golden Era series for sure, but it was Trek. Like it still has, it's Rick Berman and Brandon Braga. It's still carrying over from the next gen that started, and obviously the legacy of the original series. It still feels like a Star Trek show. What's interesting, I didn't realize, I think upon the first season rewatch, I'm kind of reinterested. Like I'm realizing what they did. So in this era, the basic setup for Enterprise is it's been 100 something years since Cochrane. The Vulcans have been helping us develop, a warp drive capability, but at the same time, they've been holding us back. They've been very skeptical of humanity out in the stars, thinking we're still kind of warlike and emotional and unkempt, and that we're not really ready yet to kind of go out there. And then finally, after about 100 years, we developed the first Warp 5 capable vessel. And I guess anything less than Warp 5, seemingly you can bop around the solar system, but you can't do interstellar travel with any regularity. I guess the way I think I looked up recently the way the warp stuff works. Like Warp 1 is the speed of light, but Warp 2 is not just 2 times the speed of light, it's a little more. And then Warp 3 is a little bit more. I think it grows exponentially. So by the time you get to Warp 9, like you're zipping around in a pretty quick fashion. So Warp 5 is kind of the galactic speed limit at this era in Earth history. Nobody has ships that are capable of that much more than Warp 5. So with that, it creates an interesting, conflict between the Vulcans and the humans. We've formed Starfleet. We're ready to kind of kick out past the solar system and start exploring and join sort of the quadrant, as a kind of a new player. So the Enterprise NX-01, the first Warp 5 capable ship, is created. Jonathan Archer is the captain. And reluctantly, the Vulcans kind of give their blessing for us to go ahead and explore. So that's kind of the setup. So what's interesting is when you first start and you're seeing episodes, no shields. Okay, what they have is what they call polarized hull plating. So I guess the polarization to a certain degree helps deflect energy weapons, right? So there's no shields. The transporter is in its infancy. So I think they were the first ship to get a transporter installed, but they hardly use it. Mostly this is a shuttlecraft based exploration thing. The times that I think in the first season, maybe 2-3 times the transporter was used, and everyone on the ship is still very leery. Nobody really wants to use it. It's kind of a last ditch thing, which I think makes good for stories. I think Star Trek in general has been very good at not allowing the transporter to be a deus ex machina in every story. Like, we're in trouble, we'll just beam you out of there. There's always interference, ionization in the atmosphere, and can't get a lock. Like, they have all these things that they use to keep the tension on when crew members are in trouble on the planet, instead of like, well, just beam people out everywhere. But it's nice that it's even further away in the series. There's no tractor beam. They have these actual mechanical grapplers that they use to grab stuff. There's no food replicators. They have something called, I think, protein synthesizers that the chefs use, but there's a full chef, so there's no Earl Grey tea hot kind of thing going on. And yeah, so the immediate limitations, and their weaponry is, they have these torpedoes. I don't know if they're photon torpedoes yet, not even. They don't have phasers yet. They have these other guns, whose the name I'm forgetting now, but they're so undergunned. So when they're out, dealing with Klingons and Andorians or whatever, they're usually under weaponized. Like they always have trouble stepping in to, the Vulcans ships are like way more technologically advanced. So we're kind of the scrappy new kids on the block, but our fists aren't very big yet. So which makes it, there's very little. There are very little episodes where the Enterprise is like a powerful presence in a sense. Like it's always outgunned and outfought in a way. So not a lot of space battles in that way, but it's interesting. No Federation yet, so it's really, it's Starfleet, but no Federation. So, it hasn't been formed yet. I think the idea was they were going to do the full 7 seasons, and like maybe the last season was going to be the creation and formation of Starfleet. But they had to kind of jam that in to the end of season 4 when they found out they weren't canceled. So, and again, no Starfleet. They're just meeting the Klingons for the first time in this season, which is kind of neat. No Romulans yet. The Romulans, war hasn't happened yet. So that's off. No Borg. There's Ferengi, which is like, I feel like is a bit of a retcon, but not much Ferengi. No Prime Directive either, which is interesting. And at least some of the episodes in the first season are dealing with this, like when the Enterprise crew comes to certain conflicts or certain situations, like they have to figure out like, well, do we interfere here? Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And you hear in the dialogue in the shows, like, that the Earth Starfleet hasn't really come up with a protocol yet for dealing with other civilizations and other peoples. So I think that was kind of interesting because it does add, there's no clear directive now when this stuff happens, and it adds into kind of the plot of the show where Archer and the crew have to kind of deal with what's happening without clear directives in that way. So all of that is great. Like I forgot, that's a really interesting, and I'm wondering when they were sitting around the writing room coming up with the show, where they were like, these are all areas that will create conflict and will be interesting for watchers of all the other shows, all these things that we've taken for granted that have existed. Powerful ships and, heavy duty warp drive and, all this stuff, Federation and all gone. And at least for the first season, I have to give them credit. It really does feel like a single ship just kind of out exploring and getting into trouble. And, there are no star bases. So if there's repairs that have to get done or they're damaged and they're like, multiple light years away from Earth, like they're really screwed. So it's really much more of like an exploration. Whereas, even the original series was supposedly this 5-year mission, but they weren't out. It wasn't like Voyager where they were out exploring untold regions. They kept coming in and out of the Federation territory as they were exploring. They got involved in Federation conflicts and all that stuff. But this one, they're out on their own. There are no other ships. This is the only Earth ship that's Warp 5 capable. So when they're out there, and it was kind of interesting. They did, I think, in the end of the first season, there were a couple episodes that had to deal with the fact that like they had to send out a distress call. They needed help with some ship repairs, and they built some plots around. Actually, that may have been the beginning of season 2, maybe beginning. But anyway, that's again, it's kind of it's good fodder for stories, and and so the more as I'm rewatching it now, I was like, this is actually a really good idea. To do a pre-Federation kind of early Earth exploration, because it really does make things much more, there's more stakes in general for things. So anyway, it was kind of cool to just kind of recognize that. The only addition that they've made, which I don't like, I feel like all of that was, that's plenty. Like all of those elements that's plenty of plot food, as it were, for a show. But they've added in this thing called the temporal Cold War. So starting with, Enterprise, we're becoming aware that there are these two factions that are waging this war in time. And in certain episodes of the show, they will revisit this temporal Cold War, and people will beam to the ship from the future or the past and tell Archer, oh, you've got to do this thing or you've got to do that thing. And I think it's overkill. I don't think you really need it. And once you start dealing with time travel, it generally is, unless you're doing it as a one-off, the Enterprise getting thrown back in time and having to deal with, Nazi Germany, or be thrown back in time with Gary Seven. Unless you do like one-offs that are accidental, or, The Guardian Forever, it's kind of, when it's an ongoing thing, you're just opening yourself up for plot holes and for, as you're watching it, you just recognize that as a viewer, you have no handle on the rules. Like, what are the rules of the temporal Cold War? There are none. It's just kind of a device that the writers can use to add a little mystery. When they've run out of ideas for a season, well, all right, let's do a temporal Cold War episode. We'll go back to this time period, and there'll be a, we don't know which faction is the good faction or the bad faction. Not a fan of it. Okay, so the characters for Enterprise. Archer. So far, season 1, he's kind of a stand-up Joe. Like, he does not have the charisma that Kirk has. He doesn't have the multi-layered charisma that Picard has. I'm kind of a toss-up between Janeway and Sisko. I don't think either of them are two strong characters. Like, they didn't do much with Janeway in Voyager. And I think she even talked about that in some interviews where they didn't want to sexualize her, so she wasn't allowed to have relationships. She was kind of a science geek, so she was able to geek out in some ways with B'Elanna. But for the most part, I didn't find the actress playing Janeway that compelling, or, Avery Brooks, who played Sisko. I like those shows, but more for the supporting characters. And I do like them, but they don't come close to Picard or Kirk. And I feel Bakula is kind of the same. So far, season 1. Plus, they don't do much with him. He has a dog, named Porthos, named after a character in The Three Musketeers. We don't hear much about, he does love to read, so we see a lot of books in his cabin. But not much is really done with Archer character-wise. And I find Bakula a very bland actor. He's just kind of a white, cornbread nothing, like there's not much there. There's not much going on with him. He's fine. Like, he carries the show. He has a sense of charisma that where he does, he's an imposing character. He's tall, he's broad. And he does have a sense of charisma that does, he does inhabit that captain's space in a way you need to, kind of, to make the show work. But I'm kind of lukewarm on it. T'Pol, wonderful. We're back to Spock territory, having Vulcan as a second in command. Lots of room for, always the Vulcan characters. There's always plenty of room for plot development because we as viewers are reading in to emotional states that they are continually denying not to have. And it always creates this space where those kind of characters come alive. Data, Spock, and T'Pol and Tuvok, I feel, always had an edge on other characters because of the stated, I'm a Vulcan, or I'm an android, and I don't have feelings. And yet they put these characters in positions and in situations where you as a viewer are putting emotions on them because of what's happening in the scenes. It's a wonderful thing that happens with these characters. I think the writers understand it too. So always makes them a little interesting, to be honest. And, we have a little bit about T'Pol, we get a little bit about her. But we what's interesting is we're never quite sure why she's staying on board the Enterprise, right? It's that kind of mystery about her, but we kind of like that we kind of are sensing that in and around her Vulcan-ness, she really likes this crew, and she's kind of developed a fondness for Archer and Trip and, the rest of them, and wants to stay. So something about that makes her character very likable. Jolene Blalock I don't think is very good. There's a way to play reserve, right? Nimoy played Spock wonderfully because there was so much going on. You sensed stuff going on with him, even though he was playing it straight. Same with Brent Spiner. Wonderfully played Data very well. Like, there was something in the eyes that was alive with both Spock and Data, and Tuvok as well. I feel like that I forget who that actor was, but he was very good. But to me, Jolene Blalock is like dead-eyed, and she's back and reserved, but in a way that's very dead. And I feel like whatever likability or anything that's happening with T'Pol is coming from the writers. and the creation of that character. To me, she's not bringing much to it, and her affect is so flat. I mean, I understand why, but again, from with Nimoy and Spiner, their affect is flat, but there's more. It's more going on. You can see it. But with her, there isn't anything more. Like you kind of look into her eyes when she's in scenes, and there's nothing there. Very rarely does she bring that little extra bit that you need to bring to a character like that. So yeah, I like the character, but not fond of her as an actress. Trip kind of harkens back to McCoy. I like this actor. I think he's good, and he's an interesting character. I mean, there's not much to these kind of good old boy Earth characters, these good old boy male Earth characters, right? He's a little bit of a Lothario. When they stop over at certain places, he, kind of gets involved. He's able to kind of get involved in relationships where Archer isn't, because since Kirk, they really don't do Kirk was laying everybody in the galaxy. But since then, they've really pulled back on the captain being someone who is, allowed to have relationships, intimate relationships with other people, other, beings. So Archer is still in that mold, but they let Trip do it. He's the one who will be able to go out and do the thing. So he's a likable guy, and there's not much to him, but I think the actor playing him brings a little something. So I like Trip for whatever reason. And then there's Reed, who is the tactical officer, so kind of the Worf role in a way, with weapons and military tactics. English actor, okay, again, they don't do much with him. In this first season, we don't know too much about him. He seems to be a very noble character. There's one episode where he was going to sacrifice his life for the ship. Unless that's season 2, I can't remember. But yeah, so he's okay. I don't mind him. They haven't really done much with him yet. Hoshi Sato. And what's great about, this is another thing I mentioned earlier, is that, in Star Trek, the original series and everything forward, the universal translator is like, we don't worry about language with aliens. We can pretty much talk to aliens whenever we want. The universal translator is a miracle. It saves the writers a lot of plot stuff. However, what they chose to do in this series is to play that down. So the universal translator is a new thing. So we have a communications officer who really has to deal with language. And it becomes the plot in 3 or 4 or 5 of the first season episodes where she has to actually translate or learn languages on the hoof because the universal translator is not doing it, not cutting the mustard. So that makes her, it's cool that they did that. And I like that, it's not just Uhura where, she's just like the radio operator. Hoshi is actually a linguist and has to deal with interpreting certain things. She has to learn Klingon at one point. And there's one episode where she really has to kind of learn this language on the hoof, and there's a little bit about her. Actually, her character's fleshed out a little bit, where Archer plucked her off of Earth, and she wasn't necessarily in for the whole exploration thing, but had served with Archer before and really wanted the job. So there's a nice arc with her in the beginning where she's afraid to go on away missions, and the whole more physical aspects of exploration are things that she's very illiterate, so she gets to grow a little bit. So I kind of like her. Phlox is great. I love the actor playing Phlox is great, and I love Phlox has that great crisp Star Trek diction that you need. Reminds me of Robert Picardo of Voyager. Haven't done anything with him in season 1. I'm a little surprised because in the first season, usually they'll kind of start off some character arcs with some characters for the most part. I mean, Next Gen, I feel like they did it. Deep Space Nine, they did it. Where you'll start in, you'll have 1 or 2 episodes circled around a side character that will be okay, we're finding out about their past, about their backstory. He's an alien. I forget what race he's from. He's got bones on his face, but there's no character development done for him at all. There's one episode. No, actually, I don't think until season 2, where someone has to spend an entire night in sick bay, and he's there, and we get a little bit of his habits and stuff, but 0 character development. But the actor's great, and I think he deserves some character development. So I'm hoping in future seasons that they spend a little more time with Phlox. The Vulcans obviously are big players in this universe, but they're kind of antagonists in that they're always wanting to shut the humans down, and whereas in the in the other series, they're staunch allies with humanity, and we kind of go in lockstep with them. But here, they're always a source of friction. And there's this ambassador who has kind of been the ambassador from Vulcan to the humans, who's very much like, tries to get the mission canceled at a certain point because he feels like we're mucking things up in the galaxy. So that's them. And then what they're doing in, definitely introducing the Klingons, because the Klingons in early Trek make a lot of sense, right? Because, I think humans in the Federation were at war with the Klingons for a long time. So, they're introduced as just a purely warlike race to be steered clear of. So we have them, but there's kind of lacking in other diversity. So they bring in the Andorians. The Andorians are going to play a big part, from what I remember. Not too much. We've only met them once or twice in the first season, but they'll come into play heavily in the later seasons. And the great Jeffrey Combs plays this character called Shran, who's wonderful, and he calls him Pigskin, the Pink Skin. I can't remember which, but he's a terrific actor, and he's a wonderful recurring character. And in this season, Archer does something where he kind of sides with the Andorians against the Vulcans, and it gives them, Shran kind of respects him for that. So it creates this wonderful, the Andorians are very militant. They're almost like another set of Klingons, but there's already a grudging respect now with the humans. So it's kind of interesting. So those are the main characters and the main races that they're dealing with. The Talarians are another group that is dealt with, but we don't see them at all in season 1. So now I'm going to just go down the list of episodes that I liked. I liked about half of the episodes. I thought it was a very strong season. It started out really well. They were banging every other episode. I thought was hitting on something interesting. They were dealing with, the fact that the humans were new in the galaxy. They were doing character episodes. And then the latter half of the season really kind of fell off. And the storylines were much lamer. Like they seemed to have run out of gas pretty quickly. And I'm about 5 or 6 episodes into season 2, and it's still suffering. So I'm wondering if I remember season 3 being a good one because of its a complete arc. So very curious. But anyway, so the premiere episode, Broken Bow, which is the maiden voyage of the NX-01, not much to it. A Klingon is caught being chased by the Suliban. Actually, that's another race. The Suliban, who are in the galaxy and who are kind of marauders in the galaxy. And they're also part of the temporal Cold War plot as well. They're chasing a Vulcan. They wind up shooting him, but he's rescued. And then Archer volunteers to take the body back to, Kronos. And that's, there's a little political infighting. There are some factions that don't want the body to be taken back, that are interfering with him. It's not a great first episode. The character introductions are very perfunctory. There's nothing much to it, but it does set the tone of at least Archer having a couple of chips in with the Klingons for later episodes where they can get out of things, because Arthur is now recognized as a human with honor, right? So then the third episode, Fight or Flight, was really cool. They find this ship drifting in space full of corpses. And this is one where, there are 2 factions are involved with this ship, and Hoshi has to step in to deal with the language problems, which is really, really cool. They're also way outgunned. So this is one of the first episodes where you're like, man, this is not, Constitution class or Galaxy class or whatever. Like, they're seriously like small-time players in the galaxy, and in the quadrant, I should say. So it was really good. Another episode called Unexpected, which was a great first contact story. This was great Trek, where this alien ship has been kind of in their wake, stealing energy to try to repair them. The Enterprise discovers them and then sends Trip over to actually help. And a lot of the episode is simply Trip and an opposite number, was a woman, on the ship, kind of getting to know each other, and him helping to repair the engines. But it was really cool. Like, it was back to basic Star Trek, which is like, first contact. How did that go? And it was kind of fun seeing these 2 characters learn about each other. And some of the problems that came up were interesting. So I liked that one. Terra Nova was a good one. That was about sort of a human colony that had been created, by, less than warp 5 ships or even sublight ships, where they sent out colony ships into the quadrant. And these folks had settled there. And now the Enterprise, as a Warp 5 ship, was coming upon now. And I just thought the idea was cool to think about. Like, there are humans in the quadrant, but they were, they've either been on sleeper ships or generation ships, no contact with really Mother Earth for a long time. So the Enterprise is coming upon them. So it was a really cool episode in that way. The Andorian incident was really good. It turns out, first it introduces the Andorians, but the Andorians are suspicious that this Vulcan kind of shrine, it's a shrine on this planet, but they think that the Vulcans have listening devices that are pointed towards the Andorian, their territory. And the Vulcans, of course, deny it, and then Archer finds out that, in fact, that's true, and he allows it. He could have covered it up, but he doesn't. And he's like, hey, this is kind of bullshit. The Andorians were right. You're spying on them. Which, obviously the Vulcans are not too fond of. But it was a nice moment where I could see more simplistic writing being about, well, of course, humans are going to side with the Vulcans because they want to get on their good side. But no. We're out there to kind of be ourselves. And we're, obviously the Vulcans are allies, but we're not going to, at the drop of a hat, we're not just going to say, well, it's the Vulcans, so everything's fine. And they used it as something to gain credibility with the Andorians, where Shran's like, I owe you one, Archer, So it was a good episode. I really liked it. So then there was an episode called Civilization, and they come upon a pre-warp civilization, and there are post-warp aliens that are kind of secretly on this planet mining some metal or some resources that they need. And in the process of doing it, they're poisoning a local area of the planet. And I like that, the Enterprise gets involved, and that this is classic Trek. Humanity's out there to kind of show the quadrant who we are. And we're the good guys. We are benevolent. We do good things. So Archer doesn't just leave the planet, and again, the Enterprise is outgunned big time. But instead, figures out a way to get them off the planet for good and kind of help the inhabitants recover from this disease. So it was, again, another really good episode. They really started off strong, setting up these themes and setting up what humans were doing in the galaxy. Really great. So then we have this episode called Fortunate Son, where we're reintroduced to the Nausicaans as raiders, basically pirates. And this is actually a character who I didn't mention before, this guy Mayweather, who's an ensign, who comes from, his history is that he was on a cargo ship. It's like a sublight or a Warp 1 cargo ship. And he grew up there. And there's a lot of these ships around in the quadrant, and a lot of humans have grown up on these ships. And there's a lot of solidarity around, you're a cargo kid kind of thing. And, they come upon one of those ships, and Mayweather has to deal with the people who are on there, who are not who they purport to be, and are not behaving the way they say they are. So it's really good. It's fun to see the Nausicaans again, but it's also, again, it's one of those episodes where we don't necessarily side with the cargo people over the Nausicaans, but it's more like what they're doing with these Nausicaans it's not kosher, and that that the crew investigates it. So it was good, and it gives us a nice Mayweather episode. So then Silent Enemy was an episode about how they installed because all the NX-01 has is torpedoes, and they're pretty wimpy. And there's parts of this episode also where Reed is, the targeting software is horrible. So they're targeting asteroids, and they're missing. So they're really just figuring out how to hit things in space. And these weapons that were supposed to be installed before they left space dock were not installed because of the thing with the Klingon. They kind of rushed out of space dock. So this is a way where now an additional set of weapons is acquired. They have to get plasma cannons or something. They're not phasers. But so this is an episode of how these cannons get installed on the Enterprise, which is great, because then in future episodes, when we see them, we've been through an episode of how they were created. So I enjoyed that. Then there's an episode called Dear Doctor, which is a great kind of proto-Prime Directive scene. They come upon this planet, and they discover that the dominant species on the planet is dying from a genetic disease, and the species that is kind of the underclass that is being ruled and suppressed by them is disease free. And so they have to figure out, whether to interfere or not. And they're realizing that, they could cure these kind of the dominant species on the planet. They have the technology to cure their genetic disease. But they also realize that, they're not the nicest group in the world. And them being a dominant species is actually, not a great thing for this underspecies. And so they have to decide, like, do we help them or not? And it's a really terrific episode about the beginnings of them figuring out that they need a prime directive. So really appreciated, not the ending that I expected. Sleeping Dogs is another episode that I liked. It's about the halfway point in the series where they come across a ship of Klingons that are all passed out from something that had happened. And of course, during the course of the plot, they start to wake up, and Hoshi Sato plays a main role in that. She has to start learning Klingon language. And her muffled attempts at it are humorous and also play into the plot. So it was really good. It's an episode called Fusion, where they meet, almost like Star Trek V, they meet a group of Vulcans who have embraced emotion. And we have a nice T'Pol episode where they're saying, we've decided to balance emotion and logic in our lives, and T'Pol thinks it's very dangerous. And so it's her experiences dealing with them, spending time with them, and these Vulcans wanting to help guide her towards maybe letting her emotions come up. So really solid episode. And then the cliffhanger ending is Shockwave Part 1, where the Enterprise is going down to this colony, and it's a tricky descent because they have to shut off some parts of the shuttlecraft, because if they don't, it'll ignite a part of the atmosphere and burn away, destroy this colony. And something happens, something goes wrong, in which it does happen, and the Enterprise is blamed. The Vulcans now want to recall them, and they kind of use some stuff that has happened in previous episodes as saying, like, okay, you guys you're way out of your depth. You're coming in between political factions. You're interfering in cultures. Enough is enough. You're not ready, And so Starfleet begins to recall the Enterprise. And then there's the subplot of, like, was it really an accident, or was it caused for a reason, so on and so forth. And of course, the cliffhanger ending is that the temporal time war, temporal Cold War, I should say, is involved, and we cliffhang to season 2. So that's the first season. So overall, I'd say a very solid season of Star Trek. First half of the season being very strong in laying out the themes and the difficulties that they're experiencing in this kind of Wild West that they're in. Second half of the first season really dropped the ball. Not a lot of good episodes, a lot of clunkers. I could tell right away that they kind of ran out of ideas. And so, yeah, it did not end well. And the cliffhanger episode was okay. But I would say a good chunk of the first half of the season, I was in, So I'm not going to rank these yet, I think, until I finish all 4 seasons. But I'm about a quarter of the way through season 2. I will continue to post season by season rewatches of Enterprise. So hope you enjoyed it. And thanks for watching.